In this chapter, we're going to talk about activity-based costing. Um, just to give you a head start on this, really what we're focused on in this chapter is how to allocate overhead. If you recall from previous chapters, when we're talking about product cost, we're talking about direct material, direct labor, and factory overhead. And in the previous chapter, chapter 15, we had discussed the fact that we've come up with this predetermined overhead rate in order to allocate or apply overhead from the total of actual factory overhead into each job or each product. This chapter is really all about different ways to do that. Anytime that we start talking about different ways to allocate something, then you can bet that there are going to be certain methods that are going to be preferred over others just because of their accuracy. So let's just talk really quickly again about how we assign overhead cost. Again, this is the product cost workflow. We have materials that are either direct or indirect. If materials are direct, they go straight into goods in process. If they are indirect, then they go into factory overhead. Labor is either direct or indirect. If it is direct, it goes straight into goods in process or work in process, whichever thing you want to call it. If it's indirect, it goes into factory overhead. And then all the other stuff that happens in the factory or on the manufacturing floor also gets dumped into factory overhead, such as rent, supervision, the janitorial team, things like that. And then all of the dollar value that's in this bucket, this factory overhead bucket, then gets allocated to goods in process using a predetermined overhead rate. Goods in process, obviously when they're completed, become finished goods. When it's finished goods, it becomes cost of goods sold on the income statement. So we can assign overhead to production in one of three different ways. I'm sure there are other ways that people have come up with to do it, but we're just going to focus on three. One of these you already know. It's what we've already learned how to do, and that's the single plant-wide overhead rate. But we could also assign it through departmental overhead rates or through activity-based costing. So let's just take a look at the plant-wide rate. This is a refresher. This is what we've already done. So all indirect costs go into overhead. We come up with one single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate, and then we assign it out to our products based on an activity driver. For all of the examples in this chapter, we're going to use the exact same set of data. So we're going to be talking about CartCo. CartCo builds standard go-karts and custom go-karts, and this is their budgeted direct labor hours. So they're saying that it takes, they plan to make about 5,000 units of standard go-karts, and they spend 15 direct labor hours to create every unit for a total of 75,000 hours. About 1,000 custom go-karts, 25 hours per unit, 25,000 hours for a total of 100,000 hours in the accounting cycle. And then CartCo has budgeted that they have overhead cost and direct labor of $4 million and then factory utilities of $800,000. So a total of $4,800,000. This is what they budget to be their actual overhead. And of course, they want to allocate this overhead out to the jobs. So when we try to find our plant-wide overhead rate, this again is just a refresher. It's what we've already learned. We take our total budgeted overhead cost. Think in a previous chapter we called it estimated overhead cost, same thing. And we divide it by our activity driver. In this case for our CartCo, it's going to be direct labor hours. So they're going to take the 4,800,000 and divide it by 100,000 direct labor hours. And that means that for every hour they work, whether it's on standard go-karts or custom go-karts, for every hour they work on a go-kart, $48 of factory overhead will be applied to that go-kart. So if we were to carry this through, if standard go-karts, if each unit takes 15 direct labor hours to create and we multiply it by 48, then each unit is going to have $720 worth of overhead allocated to it. Custom go-kart, same type of math, is going to have $1,200 worth of overhead allocated to it. So they continue the budget out and say, well, if a standard go-kart takes $400 in materials, $350 in labor, and now we assign the $720 of factory overhead, then our cost per unit is $1,470. They do the same math for custom. Cost per unit is $2,300. I would assume that they would use these costs then to determine what their selling price would be. If you want your selling price to be, or if you want your markup to be 100%, then most likely you're going to sell these custom go-karts for about $4,600, and then the standard go-karts for about what, $2,940 if you have 100% markup. So that's going to be the plant-wide overhead rate. Let's talk about departmental. So as you think about what happens inside the factory, there may be several departments on the factory floor that deal with your go-karts. Maybe there is one section of the factory that deals with the assembly of the go-kart, and then there is another division or department in the factory that deals with the painting and putting on all the finishing touches, maybe Department A and Department B. So the go-kart is going to go from one department over to the other department before it becomes finished. Well, what happens here? It's really the same thing as the plant-wide rate, except we're going to take those overhead costs and we're going to divide them out between Department A and Department B. We're going to figure out how much goes to Department A and how much goes to Department B. And then Department A is going to have its own overhead rate, still an estimate, and Department B is going to have its own overhead rate, again an estimate, and then we're going to allocate both of those out to each of the product. So still looking at the same 4,800,000 that we were dealing with before, we're going to say that CartCo has two departments. One's called the machining department and another is called the assembly department. Of this 4,800,000, machining uses up 4,200,000 and assembly uses up 600,000. Not only that, but the machining department is going to apply the overhead rate based on machine hours, and that kind of makes sense. Maybe that part of the process is very automated. And then the assembly department is going to base its overhead rate on direct labor hours before it does the allocation. So now if we start breaking this out, we have to make some assumptions here. We're talking about the machining department here and the assembly department over here. Still have standard, still have custom, and here's the number of units. So we're saying the standard go-karts are going to take 10 machine hours per unit and 5 direct labor hours per unit. Well, 10 machine hours per unit, 5,000 units is 50,000 machine hours. 5 hours at 5,000 unit, 25,000 direct labor hours. So you see what's happened is that for the machining department, we're estimating 70,000 machine hours. For the assembly department, we're estimating 30,000 direct labor hours. The rest of it, you already know how to do. We take the estimated overhead dollars for each department, divide it by this activity base of 70,000 hours and 30,000 hours to come up with our rate. Here's what it looks like: the total budgeted departmental overhead cost and total amount of the allocation base. So for the machining department, we take the 4.2 million divided by 70,000 machine hours to say that there's $60 per machine hour. So for every machine hour that works on one go-kart, we're going to apply $60 of overhead to allocate to that go-kart. And then the assembly department had 600,000 as its estimate, divided by 30,000 hours is going to be $20 per direct labor hour. If we carry this through, here's what happens. Here's our standard go-kart, here's our custom go-karts. We're just kind of changing the way it looks. The machining department is going to allocate $60 per machine hour at 10 machine hours per unit based on the previous slides. That's our estimate. $600 is going to go into each standard go-kart for machining and $100 for assembly. So a total of $700 of overhead is going to be allocated for each standard go-kart. And we do the same thing for the custom, but a total of $1,300 of overhead is going to be allocated to custom go-karts. Well, that's a little bit different because in the plant-wide overhead rate, standard go-karts were getting $720 each, custom were getting $1,200. So now you'll see that suddenly standard go-karts are getting just a little bit less and custom go-karts are getting a little bit more once we break it out by the departmental overhead rate. So let's just look at some of these advantages and disadvantages for the plant-wide overhead rate, that first one, the one that we already knew all about. I would just go ahead and say that the advantage to this one is that it's easy, right? We just come up with one rate, we apply it out, and that's great. The information is readily available because it's simply available. Um, the biggest advantage here is that it's consistent with GAAP. Generally accepted accounting principles is what you want to use. You want to use this plant-wide overhead rate. It really pretty much requires you to use it. Disadvantage is that the overhead cost may not bear any real relationship with direct labor hours because you're looking at the whole plant. It just doesn't necessarily fit. What does utilities really have to do with any direct labor hours? There's probably a better way to group those out. And all products may not use overhead costs in the same proportion. So, if we're applying the exact same rate to standard go-karts as we are custom go-karts, that really might not be the most accurate way to do that. What about departmental overhead rate? Well, it's a little bit more accurate, right? Because we look at one department and say, well, it has more machine hours than direct labor, so maybe we should do it that way. And then another one has more direct labor than machine, so we want to use a different activity base. So that gives us a more accurate allocation, and it's a bit more refined than plant-wide because we're not just taking one standard number. However, a disadvantage, just like the plant-wide overhead rate, it can distort product cost. It assumes that all products are similar in volume, complexity, and batch size, and assumes that departmental overhead, again, that the costs are proportional to the allocation base. And those things just may not be true because we are still taking a very standardized number and just dividing it out by two very large areas. Okay, so let's talk about activity-based costing. So it looks a lot more like the departmental, right? I mean, in the prior departmental example, we had two departments, and now it looks like we have three activities, and it really works the same as departmental. We're going to take the total overhead cost and we're going to group it into these three different areas, apply a rate, and then allocate it out to each product. So that's not the hard part. How it works now, I think, is pretty simple. But we need to talk about kind of what these cost pools really are. So as we kind of talk through this, what we really need to do is we need to identify activities that are happening on the factory floor, not areas where things are happening, but we look at different activities all over the factory and we say what things really are driven by the same base. So there might be something happening in machining that really takes more direct labor hours, as well as something in assembly that takes more direct labor hours than machine hours. Well, we're going to combine those two into one pool, even though they're in separate departments. And there's just all kinds of different ways that you can do it. So you create several different pools, and we're using a very simple model here. We're just going to do a few activity pools. But when you think about all of the different things that can happen in a warehouse or in a factory, there could be hundreds of different activities that have the same type of base. Well, for the accountant, it's very difficult to apply a predetermined overhead rate to hundreds of different activities. So why not group them into pools if they have the same type of driver? If you can identify 30 activities that all really should be allocated based on direct labor hour, why not put them all into the same pool? And if you have 20 activities that really could be grouped up by the machine hour, why not put them all into the same pool? So we identify all of these activities and the cost they cause, and then we group them into pools. We trace the overhead cost to those pools. We determine an activity rate for each pool, just like we did in departmental, and then we assign the overhead cost to cost objects. So identifying activities and the cost they cost. This is the most difficult part. So here at Cartco, they've identified, it looks like 6 different activities: machine setup, machine repair, factory maintenance, heating and lighting, assembly line power, and engineer salaries. So this is just 6, not 100, it's just 6. This probably wouldn't have been hard to deal with as it is, but this is an example. We don't want to have to deal with hundreds of them. So just 6 of them, and we need to identify, are there any of these 6 activities that we can group together and put into one pool so that we don't have to apply an overhead rate 6 different times? Can we skinny this down a little bit? So that's what's kind of happening here. So we're going to look at the overhead cost that happens. So machine setup costs $700,000, machine repair is $1.3 million. The factory maintenance activity costs us about $800,000. Engineer salaries cost us $1.2 million. Assembly line power costs us $600,000. Heating and lighting costs $200,000. So there's the $4.8 million applied to each activity. Now we need to group the activities into pools. So here's what it is. We've decided that there are, out of those 6 activities, there are 4 pools. So we're going to whittle it down to 4 different pools, and we're going to call those pools craftsmanship setup, design modification, and plant services. And here's what it looks like. In craftsmanship pool, we're going to call that just the assembly line power. That's the activity. We already determined it costs us $600,000, and we're going to base that on direct labor hours. The setup pool is going to contain machine setup and machine repair because they seem to go well with the number of batches that are being produced. Our total cost for each of those activities are listed here, so now the total pool cost for the 200 batches is $2 million. Design modification is just going to contain the engineer salaries of $1.2 million based on the number of designs, and then plant services pool is going to contain the activities of factory maintenance and heating and lighting. They're the cost for $1 million, and we're going to base that on the square footage. So there's our $4.8 million. There's the different activity drivers, the 4 different activity drivers that we're going to have for our cost pools. Now we need to compute the activity rates used to assign overhead cost to final cost. Do you think that you could do that at this point? That would be a question. I'm just going to back up one slide. Do you think you could figure out what the activity rates are based on this slide? I think you probably can. I think you figured it out. All we're going to do is we're going to take, remember, our estimated total cost divided by our estimated activity driver, 600,000 divided by 30,000, 2 million divided by 200, 1.2 million divided by 10, and 1 million divided by 20,000. That's exactly how we're going to find those activity rates. I'm sure they're only going to show us 1 or 2 of them. This is a great slide. We need to think about this. Proper determination rates are going to depend on proper identification of the factor that drives the cost. That's very, very important. Knowing that it's direct labor or machine hours or square footage, and then the proper measurement of those activities. Again, there's the formula for it. The example is going to be the craftsmanship pool, which had $600,000. We divide it by the 30,000 hours. If you went back a couple slides, you'd see that, which means in the craftsmanship pool, for every direct labor hour, we're going to assign $20. So here's what it looks like. Craftsmanship, we apply out all of the rates. Craftsmanship is going to be $20 per direct labor hour. Setup's going to be $10,000 per batch. Design modification, we're going to assign overhead at $120,000 per design. Engineers make some money, right? Maybe I'm in the wrong line of business. And then plant service is going to be $50 per square foot. And now we need to assign the overhead cost in each activity cost pool to the final cost object using these activity rates. We're going to illustrate that again looking at the craftsmanship pool and just for the standard go-karts. So we take the activity consumed by the activity rate. For standard go-karts, it was going to be 25,000 direct labor hours. If you go back and look at the slide on that, 25,000 direct labor hours, now at the pooled rate of $20 per direct labor hour, it's going to be $500,000. So what has to happen though here is that we can get down to the activity cost allocated for each pool for standard go-karts and for custom go-karts. And you'll see what's happening. Now I have $1.5 million of activity cost allocated for standard go-karts and $3.3 million for custom go-karts. Isn't the $3.3 million plus $1.5 million the original $4,800,000 that we were talking about? And the answer is absolutely it is. That's the $4.8 million. How are we ever going to figure out what the cost is per unit? How much overhead allocation should I apply for each unit for standard go-karts and custom go-karts? Think about that for a second. How am I going to get that in there? Well, don't I have a budget for how many standard go-karts I'm going to produce and how many custom go-karts I'm going to produce? If I go all the way back, if you'll recall, I plan to produce 5,000 standard go-karts and 1,000 custom go-karts. So if I wanted to get to a per unit cost for applied overhead, couldn't I just take 1,500,000 divided by 5,000 units and 3,300,000 divided by 1,000 units? I think that's exactly what we're going to do. Here it is, the 1,500,000, 5,000 units. Look, overhead cost for standard go-karts is going to be 300 each, and it's going to be 3,300 for custom. Do you remember what that was for the plant-wide overhead rate and the departmental overhead rate? It's quite different. There it is. The plant-wide method, we were applying 720 to standard. Now we're applying 300 to standard. 1,200 custom and 3,300 to custom. What's important about this? Isn't it the total cost? Once I add my direct material and direct labor to these numbers, it's the total cost that helps me determine my price. So here's the problem. If my competition is using activity-based costing and I'm using plant-wide method, then my price on standard go-karts, my selling price is probably much higher than my competition. And he's probably selling more standard go-karts than I am. Not only that, I'm probably selling custom go-karts too cheap, and he's making what he should be making on custom go-karts. So it can really skew how we relate to our competition. All right, let's just talk about advantages and disadvantages of activity-based costing. I'm going to think that first and foremost, it's probably more difficult. That's going to be a disadvantage. On the advantage side, it's more accurate. It's more effective overhead cost control. I can split out and see exactly what each activity is doing. I can focus on relevant factors. I have better management of activities. And look, it even continues. And it shows me the cost of quality because I can really break it down into a much more detailed fashion. But the disadvantages, not nearly as many. The biggest one is that it's hard. The cost to implement and maintain it is going to be a little bit more because it's much more difficult. There's still some uncertainty with decisions. You can never be perfect in this because it's still a guess. The biggest disadvantage is this one, is that it's not acceptable under generally accepted accounting principles. So if you're using activity-based costing in your managerial accounting to allocate overhead, you must also use the plant-wide rate when you report for financial accounting. In other words, the activity-based costing approach is only going to be good for internal use, for internal managerial reports. It still provides us a better picture. So in the right factory setting, it really should try to be used if we can use it and if the cost doesn't outweigh the benefit. All right, let's just talk real quick. We're almost done with this. We'll talk real quick about a few types of activities that cause overhead cost. Again, the most difficult part of applying activity-based costing is trying to figure out how to pool those activities up. Well, the best way to look at it is to look at an activity and say, is it a unit level cost, a batch level cost, activity, a unit level activity, a batch level activity, a product level activity, or a facility level activity. Let's just talk about each of those real fast. Unit level activities are performed on each product unit, such as providing electricity to power the machinery. So if we were looking at the electricity, we'd say, you know what? That's a unit level activity. So let me group all of my unit level activities together. If we're looking at batch level activities, those are the ones that are performed on each batch or group of units, kind of like setting up the machine to run several go-karts through at once. That would be a batch level type of activity. Product level are those that are performed on each product line and are not affected by numbers of units or batches. This would be the design engineering, this would be the cost of the plans, right? That would be product level. An engineer is going to give me a plan for standard go-karts, and I'm going to build many standard go-karts So it's really a product level activity. And then there's a facility level activity that really is going to look at sustaining facility capacity, maybe the heating and lighting and the gas, things like that. So it's really not caused by any specific product. And that is the end of chapter 17.